Welcome to the Neural Talks, your gateway to the forefront of AI innovation. I'm your host, Ranjit Malarkot, and together we'll explore the AI revolution with the brightest minds pushing boundaries and shaping the future. Through candid conversations, they share hard-won insights as we unlock the transformative power of AI. Get informed, get inspired. This is the future, and you're in the front row. So let's welcome our guest, Bharani Subramaniam, Thoughtworks CTO for India and Middle East. Bharani is a veteran of tech. He has a passion for simplifying complex, design. He's led the charge on data engineering, real-time analytics. He has extensive experience in building high-performance distributed systems. Bharani, welcome to the Neural Talks. Really happy to have you.
Pleasure to be here, Ranjit. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure as well, Bharani. So, Bharani, just going to start with a very simple topic and sort of go back to the origin.
Mm-hmm.
When was the first time you paid attention to AI on a serious note?
Okay. On a serious note, I think we've all had our sample of AI sometime in the past, but on a serious note, in one of the projects, we were trying to optimize the search relevancy for a Latin American client. So that was the time we stumbled upon BERT, so the model from Google based on transformers.
For our viewers, BERT is an ML framework for natural language processing from Google, released around 2018, like Bharani was just sharing with us. And it was one of the first foundational, language models to demonstrate the power of transformers. So, Bharani, talking about language, foundational language models, there's been an explosion of information about this, and an explosion of information on the applications of LLMs with so much in the news today. And would love to get to know, from you, how and why do you think LLMs are relevant today?
I think LLM is not a news to anyone in any of our viewers, right? Because it's ChatGPT with its very simplistic user interface made sure that the Gen AI and LLM has reached the general public. So the reason why you can't ignore LLMs or generative AI right now is it has basically reduced the cost of innovation, the cost of intelligence to bare minimum, right? Anybody can write a very neat looking email. Anybody can brainstorm ideas at nearly zero cost. Of course, you have to pay. So that's why it's so ubiquitous today. It's there everywhere. And almost all product companies are thinking about incorporating LLMs in some form or other in their product journey. So, yeah.
So for the leaders in tech, product, business, if we were to ask you saying, why should they pay attention to LLMs? What would be your advice to them?
I think the first advice is you have to make sure what part of a product does make sense for Gen AI, right? Because it's not one size fits all. You can't throw Gen AI into a product and assume you can capitalize on FOMO. Maybe you will have success, but what really is important is how well you can integrate AI into your product in a way that makes sense to you and your customers. So I would say go back to the drawing board and get to the product thinking and try to incorporate AI in a way it makes sense for your product, and not buy into the FOMO that, oh no, this is the shiny new thing and let's build a chatbot into your product, which does not make sense.
So right in the first podcast, Bharani, we're sort of wanting to send our people back to the drawing board. Not such a good thing, but anyway, I mean, we take that in, with full authenticity coming from somebody like you.
Sure.
So we get that LLMs are complex. We also get that there's a lot of value to be tapped and there's a lot of value to be generated from LLMs. So if you were to look at how somebody should approach this, and if you were to break this down into their essentials as to how somebody should go about wanting to sort of ease a customer pain, or to ease an internal pain, or to basically develop something that's actually going to cause a transformation at the customer end or on the efficiency or at the efficiency end, what would be your framework to sort of approach this?
Yeah, so like I said, start with the hygiene, and let's assume that our listeners have like checked that check mark. Then I would think of what is your mode as a business, right? Like you would be having a number of assets in your enterprise. You would be having data that differentiate you from your competitors. Start with that, because a model is only as good as the data that you have, because right now all models are available to everybody, right? Like either through subscriptions or through open source. So in a way, AI and generative AI has leveled the playing ground, right? Like the only way in which you can compete in this world is with your enterprise data that you have collected over the years, right? So in a way, you can relate that big data era had a lot of promise that data is the new oil and data is your mode. I would say uh, Gen AI is the one that is going to deliver that promise to you. Because with all the data that you have about the customers, you can now make a very personalized recommendation to those customers because you have very personalized data. So after the whole product hygiene, I would say start with your data, and how clean your data is and how diverse your data is has a direct influence on the success of adopting Gen AI in your product.
So if I was to ask you,
Yeah.
How do diversity and quality of the data affect this entire, workflow of producing an LLM that actually is producing outcomes and results that are desirable? Could you spend a minute on that?
Yeah, it's very hard to get it right. Let me start by that way, right? Like we all knew what happened to the Google model that started producing images wrongly about Vikings and ethnicity. So we know that. So it is difficult for Google to get it right. I'm sure it is difficult for everybody to get it right. So the reason why you need to have a diverse data is because you don't want to particularly bias a subset of your customer, right? If you do not have data, let's say for by gender or some other angle and dimensions, your model is going to reflect that, because let's be honest, right? We don't have data that is balanced in all dimensions. So the first thing is you should be aware of what is the lack in diversity in your data set. Not just the diversity, the trustworthiness of the data set. So both are key. You need to have a trustworthy data, and you also need to have a diverse data. So you represent your customer base in a correct fashion in your model. Because otherwise, what would happen is the model will obviously get biased when you start fine-tuning or using techniques like RAG, because the quality of your data will show up in the answer that comes out from Gen AI. So that's why it's really key that you pay attention to both the quality and the diversity of your data set, irrespective of whether you're fine-tuning or using techniques like RAG.
So we covered data and the points related to data. What's next?
Right. So once you have data, the next thing is you need to think about, what model are you going to choose as your foundational model? And there are many choices out there, right? So there is, when it comes to model selection, so there are a number of criteria, like the size of the model, right? There are like 3 billion, 7 billion, 30 billion, and so on and so forth. So one thing to note that it is not always bigger the size, the better it is for you. So you need to choose what's the optimal size of the model for the problem that you're trying to solve, right? So the model and the size is on one end. And then naturally, the next question would be, should you go for a hosted platform as a service model so that you don't have to worry about anything, just pay for the API tokens and you're all set, right? So that's one option. So go for a publicly hosted platform as a service model. Or if you have to bite the bullet, you can go down the path of self-hosting the model yourself, right? Like I need to call out that there are always trade-offs, right? There are trade-offs of cost, there is trade-off of privacy, But the most important trade-off would be that you have the necessary skill set, the kind of people that you need to actually run a self-hosted model in production. So that would be one of the key decision factors. So yes, after data, I would think about the models, the weights, and where I'm going to host it.
So we have a good summary on data and what's important on data. So now that we have this, Bharani, what would you recommend as next?
Yeah, after data, I think it's obvious choices. You need to pick a model and also pick the size of the model to begin with, right? So that would be the next step.
How does somebody, an engineering leader, a product leader that's about to actually embark on a project, what would you recommend as to how they approach, selecting a model, narrowing down the options, and then sort of zeroing and saying, hey, this is, I think, the best fit for us?
Yeah, I think picking a model is non-trivial. So the first thing I would start with is, are you dealing with just text? Is it just text-based LLM that you're after? Or do you have an audio and video and you need a multi-model capability? So that would be your first lever to look at. Like, what kind of features are you expecting from the generative model? After that would obviously be, should you go with the commercial self-hosted models, commercial models, or do you want to pick an open source and then go the route of self-hosting it, either yourself or in the cloud? So that's up to you. So yeah.
So while talking about these models, does size always matter, Bharani? Should I, as an engineering dev or tech leader, always pick the model that has the highest number of parameters and the highest number of highest volume of training data sets? Does that really always matter?
Not always is the question. It does matter, but there is a difference between 7 billion and a 30 billion parameter. For all practical reasons, you can go with the 7 billion for, let's say, your local, when you're developing with the models locally. If you are hosting in your laptop, obviously you can't host a larger model. So in those cases, you can work with models that are of lower weight. But in production, go with the size that is most appropriate for your account and your production settings. So there is no simple answer, but larger is not always the better.
So another question on models, Bharani. Are models today so advanced that it doesn't matter as to which industry you're building a solution for and which domain you're actually deploying this model for? Or does that actually have a bearing today? And people have to be careful about selecting models based on how they're, which industry and customer that they're actually working for.
Yeah, good question, Ranjit. So the foundational model is usually trained on the publicly available data, right? Like, say, what's available on the internet is what the companies who produce the model train them on. So when it comes to industry specific, that is more towards the data on which the model is trained on. Of course, the model itself make a difference. And we have seen, for example, is it based on Llama 2 or Llama 3 or GPT 3.5 and so on and so forth. But when it comes to industry specific, it's almost, should I choose a model that is already trained on industry specific data? If so, if something is available for you, then go with that model, because it's going to reduce the amount of fine tuning that you have to do on your side, right? But if you want to have a generic model that needs to answer and interact with users, then go with something that is generic. So it's a choice between domain-specific models and a domain-neutral model. It's totally based on your domain, but I would say narrower, the better, right? If you're working in retail, pick a model that's already trained in a retail domain, that if it is available, that'll be good for you.
Awesome. So when it comes to models, is there a difference between commercial and open models today? What should people pay attention to, and why?
I think today, as we are recording, the commercial models do have an edge over the open source model, and that's a known fact. right?
Okay.
So there is even a study that says the open source model are catching up and they are like 18 months behind the commercial models. So there is a gap, and the gap is narrowing day by day. So if you don't mind the gap, you can go with an open source model. But if you want to be on the cutting edge, then I would say pick a commercial model.
Great. I think we wrapped up quite a bit on the model in terms of size, open source or commercial, the other factors related to domain and industry that actually affect the model and its performance. So once the model is wrapped up, what would you think are the next layers that sort of operate to then sort of weave, the model, your data, put all this together, and then get a solution out, to production? How would you break that down?
I think once you have the model in place and you have decided the size and all of that, so the next big thing, I think we should go back to the data and see, tie these two. Like you have a lot of corporate data, and the model, maybe it is trained on your domain, but does not have access to your data. So the current technique that marries these two together is what we call RAG. So RAG is the technique with which, so RAG stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. So let's take an example. If the user is asking a question to the LLM, you need to retrieve all the context related to the question from your data and then augment that in the generation so that LLM gives you answers specific to your data. So that's RAG in a nutshell. And that's the most important part of your architecture. So to get your RAG right, you definitely need a vector store, right? So that would be the next big thing for you to decide architecturally is what's going to be my vector store.
So Bharani, we spoke about data, we spoke about model, and now we just brought in private data or enterprise data that can sort of be used to plug into this generic model that's been trained on vast data sets to make it, to give it a context of the enterprise and to give it a context of the business in which it's actually being operating. And now you mentioned a very interesting technique and topic, RAG. So I want to spend a little more time on that and sort of just double click. So when you mean RAG, Bharani, how does one go about implementing RAG in a project? Does a model have any bearing on what RAG or how the RAG is implemented?
I think before I get into RAG, I think I did not introduce this concept. So there are these things called embeddings, right? Like because these models understand only numbers and vectors. So when you talk about a higher dimensional text or an audio or a video, you need to reduce the complexity to a vector of numbers, right? And those are embeddings. So why did I bring or talk about embeddings while explaining RAG? RAG is a technique, right? And the technique allows the model to have contextual information in the prompt, which is not given by the user. So if the user says, I want to talk about buying a house, if you're the bank who has a lot more context about the person, then you can enrich that prompt with the information about the user and the financial status and credit history and so on and so forth. And to do that, you need to search for a similar document in your vector store, right? And then get the result and add it to the prompt. So this whole process of enriching the prompt with additional context through a similarity search is RAG. So that's what you do. And it's totally independent of the model. So that is the first question people ask. Should I choose the embedding that is tied to the model's embedding? There is a lot of confusion. The answer is no. You can choose your own embedding. You can have a number of different embeddings for your RAG, which is not to be confused with the embeddings of the model itself. Both are totally independent.
And does the size of the model, the data source from which you're picking up, the size of the data, do any of these have a bearing on the RAG?
So the one important aspect to think of the size is actually the context window, right? Like because you don't want to give 1 million tokens when your context window is, let's say, 20,000 or 10,000. So you need to think about the size of the chunk or the chunking strategy. That's probably the only thing, but not the weights of the model or anything like that. It's just the context window that determines the chunk size.
Okay. So stepping back a bit, I think we've covered data, we've covered the model, we brought in enterprise data and context from the enterprise or from the business in which we're deploying this.
Yeah.
Then we spoke about RAGs to sort of embed this data as part of the larger model and sort of make it more contextual. But these are all loosely coupled pieces. I mean, these are all floating around.
Sure.
What exists today to sort of wrap all this, from a developer's point of view? How do we wrap all this, make it easy to deploy, and then sort of put it together? What are the components of that? Could we, sort of give an overview on that?
Yeah, that's good, because we just introduced components and building blocks, and we did not tie all of them together. So if I have to draw an analogy, if I'm building a traditional application, your API server or your web framework is the one that sort of orchestrates all the moving parts, right? Like you need something similar when you're building a GenAI based product, and there are a number of orchestrators out there, right? Like obviously, the most popular one is LangChain, but there are more options now in the market, like semantic search and so on. Sorry, semantic kernel. But you can write the orchestration logic yourself. Like, it's not that complicated. So bottom line is, you need a piece of code that ties your data, your vector store, the APIs and tokens to the LLM, and all of them together, and serve the request response via an API token. So that's mostly it. So you can either go down the route of, I will write this custom, or you can choose an orchestrator like LangChain or semantic kernel. That's up to you.
You mentioned vector stores, right? So let's just pause and double click on that, because that's another essential component, of this entire piece. So could you sort of explore that a little for us? And vector stores, why are they relevant? And how does one make a decision on a vector store?
Good question. So vector store, like I spoke about embeddings, right? Like, you need vector store to actually store and search these embeddings. And why do you need this? Why can't you just use your own favorite, traditional databases? Is because of the kind of search that you would do on these data, right? Like in your traditional database, you would probably do a table scan or an index-based lookup. Whereas with these vectors, you would do a higher dimensional similarity search. For example, if you have a picture of an apple and an orange, obviously they are different fruit, but you want to see, what is the equivalent fruit that is as nutritious as apple? Maybe you will pick on orange as an answer or not, right? So for you to do these kind of similarity search in a higher dimensional space, you need a different index. And this is where vector search come in, because they help you do these searches effectively. So that's why you need them. For the second part, Ranjit, it depends on, should you go with an extension of your database that allows this vector search, or should you go with a new vector store by itself, right? There are an n number of vector stores available in the market. The decision totally depends on how much volume of data that you're going to store and how quickly you want to retrieve that. So if you want to horizontally scale your vector store, then obviously a simple extension to Postgres is not going to cut it. Whereas if you want to reduce the complexity and not have two data sources, then you're better off with just installing an extension like pgvector on top of Postgres that gives you this vector search capability. So there are trade-offs, and you have to pick and choose which one to go with.
No, great. I mean, so this is a question that I think plagues almost every project that's not a greenfield project, I guess.
Yeah.
Because almost all of them will have existing data sources that are catering to customer systems, or to enterprise systems, or to to systems that are deployed on SaaS infrastructure. So I think that gives a fairly balanced view in terms of how to look at this. So we spoke about, a model. We spoke about data. We spoke about how to bring, custom data in or private data in, frameworks, orchestrators, and now we spoke about vector stores that are an essential part. So I have another question, slightly unrelated, but nevertheless an important topic. If I was an entrepreneur, or if I was a CTO looking to sort of automate a workflow, right? And if LLMs are already so good at answering within context, embedding information from inside my business and enterprise to those answers, can they make my workflows better and run workflows better end to end for me? So if I had workflows for either customer success, or for customer complaints, or if I had workflows for inventory optimization, inventory, sort of taking inventory and then sending it down down the value chain, does one really even think and consider LLMs for some of these?
I think if you think of goes back to the hygiene part, Ranjit. If you have decided already that generative AI is going to enrich your business workflow, right? So we've come this far of like plugging in LLM, feeding in the relevant data, and getting the right responses. But there is still a missing link, because if you think of what an LLM is, it is like this super brain. And the brain by itself is important. It's critical for your body, but you need to connect it with the sensory organs. Otherwise, it's not going to send anything from the outside world. It cannot make an action in the outside world. So that's where these concept of agents come in. So you can think of agents as a processor or a framework for you to execute something in an outside world in a deterministic fashion, right? So LLMs, no matter how good they are non-deterministic in nature, right? If you ask the same question again, there are chances that you'll get a different response. But you can't afford to do that in a deterministic code. So if you want to check out a product, you have to check out a product. You have to check out the shopping cart. So if you want to make deterministic action and side effect in the real world, you need to model that in some kind of an agent or a processor. That's where they come in, and you can think of agent as the sensory organs to your LLM.
Today, if I'm actually looking at workflows, there are so many options for me. I could actually automate with Python code, or any code. For example, there are rule engines, there are workflow engines. There are those who actually use Zapier to actually plug in and sort of automate workflows in a slightly loosely coupled manner. In what specific instance should somebody say that I should now consider an LLM or an AI agent to sort of do this for me? And what benefit will that bring?
So for this, Ranjit, so if you know your workflow and you can predefine your workflow and you can code that deterministically, I would say don't go with LLM, because that's going to complicate your job. But on the other hand, if the combinations and permutation is so high that you cannot look at all the possible choices the workflow is going to take, then you have to learn the workflow, and that's where the LLM comes in, right? So if you have a fairly simplistic deterministic workflow, don't you go the traditional route of rules and rule-based engines and rule-based workflow. But when you have a very deep, very complex workflow with a number of options, then you go with a machine learning model in the back, so that it's not deterministic. You don't know the choices the user are going to take. And hence you need this dynamic engine, which can be through an LLM. So that would be my choice.
Interesting, very interesting perspectives, Bharani. I think this chat will probably require a double click on this topic, and maybe we'll have a subsequent podcast on this as well.
Sure.
But deterministic versus non-deterministic and learning abilities of LLMs coming into play. I think we're sort of talking about a lot of topics for our viewers here. So now that we have, again, stepping back, we started with, data models, frameworks, orchestrators, plugged in data, put in RAG, and then spoke about vector stores. And then now sort of spoke a little about AI agents. I think before, the step that comes next, as we understand, is sort of then putting it out there for people to consume, right? So, what and how does one do that?
I think if you've come this far in the journey, then you need to start thinking about, your inference and serving layer, which is basically where you're going to host the model and how you're going to run. Those are very big questions to ask, is because all the choices that you've made so far, right? Am I going to use a fine-tuned model? Am I going to quantize the model? All of that has a say in like how you host and serve. But two big choices in my mind is, should you go with a self-hosted model where you do everything, or should you just give the controls to the public, hosted companies who host all these models and give you a way to consume that via an API? So those are the two choices.
So, Bharani, we spoke about consumption and serving. One model is consuming something that's already hosted outside commercially, where the engineering, the reliability, and all the other aspects of serving that is taken care of by someone else, and you pay a cost. But there will clearly be people who will be considering saying, should I host a model that I just found? What would be your recommendation? Why should they choose to host a model? What should they think about? What should they be cautious about?
Yeah, good question, Ranjit. So the primary reason why people go for a self-hosting their own large language model is privacy, right? Like, I don't want to send my enterprise data that is so dear, so close to me, to a third-party provider, right? So that's probably the number one reason. It could be for a number of factors as well. I'm in a regulated industry, and I can't convince my regulator that it's going to be safe outside my perimeter of the network. So that's one. So privacy is a big part of it. And second would be that is cost, right? Like, let's face it, it's very simple to just consume a publicly hosted model. But in production, when you're looking at production traffic with so many users and so many conversations back and forth, the cost is an important factor. So if you want to have a stronger control on cost, then you might think of self-hosted option as well. But the key decision factor is going to be on your skill set, right? Do you have the skill set in-house to operate a large language model in production is going to be important. Those are the three factors I would think of, Rajit. It's going to be privacy, cost, and your skill set.
And would you think that the skills required to run a foundation model are significant, and they will be different from the regular skill sets of actually consuming an API, and somebody has to obviously be a lot more significantly deep in the subject?
Definitely yes, because this model and the whole space, the whole industry is evolving. It is non-trivial to actually run inference at scale. Everybody struggles because it puts a lot of strain on your infrastructure. You have to deeply understand the memory usage. When you're going to have 50 users in a small test group is totally different from when you're going to open it to 1 million users, right? So yes, short answer, yes.
Okay. So while we're on this topic of self-hosting, a model, wanted to quickly check in, right? We spoke about model size, model parameters. We spoke about, a couple of other aspects. Do model size, the model parameters, and data sizes, do they have a bearing on this decision in terms of should you choose to self-host and should you choose to defer to a commercial hosting? What would you recommend?
I don't think so. It's just the model size that matters, but the larger the model, the more memory it's going to consume, and more CPU it's going to consume.
And cost.
And cost.
And with self-hosting, is there a risk associated with people hacking into your model, or would you say that that risk is considerably higher when you're actually using a commercial model on a SaaS basis?
So that's an important topic. So when it comes to models, you need to understand the legality of self-hosting model. And the kind of the legal cases that you're exposing your company to, right? So if you go with a self-hosted model, you can, based on the provider, you can get some indemnity saying they certify that the model is trained on a data set for which they have access to and they have licenses to. If you are self-hosting it, you're taking it all on yourself. So you need to be sure that you're protected from the legal aspect as well. So I would say, yes, skills matter, but the legal or aspects of it matter equivalently. So check with your legal team before you can do this.
Wow, I think AI is now at the center of legal, and legal is at the center of AI as well. So this is fascinating. I mean, so obviously we'll talk on the non-technical aspects, of success of an LLM maybe a little bit later on. But glad you brought it up, Bharani. This is fantastic. I think so. We've covered a lot. We've thought of a solution, put in together the building blocks, wrapped it in the frameworks, put in all the other essential components like RAG, vector stores, and now also deployed it for serving. But going to production is a big step.
Yeah.
Before we get there, if you were to give a CTO checklist or an engineering/dev lead checklist saying, hey, before you jump in, look for these things, what would your list look like?
I think this is a fantastic question. And I keep saying this, right? Like, since the whole ChatGPT came out, like mid last year, everybody started doing some kind of a POC. And this year is the year where they want to get ROI back and they want to put in production. So my checklist would be, Ranjit, is to first ask the team, do you have good observability in place, right? It used to be an option before, but it's no longer an option now. You can't go live with a complex system with generative AI in the architecture without any tools for you to debug things in production or make sense of what's going on in production. So observability would be the first key pillar before you put your model in production.
So when you say observability, Bharani, I think a bunch of us who are used to digital systems have some context in observability. But in the context of a Gen AI system or an LLM, what would you specifically call out as observables, for people to pay attention to?
Exactly, because let's talk about observing a deterministic system, right? So if you have a transaction processing engine, if you observe all the parameters that's going in and what's coming out, and that's going to be enough for you to debug this in production. It's very similar in LLM. So if you have adopted OpenTelemetry as a standard in your tech stack, you can adopt the same with the GenAI stack. But you need to record a lot more new metadata as well, because what happens is all these models evolve over time. The prompts behave differently over time because your data is going to evolve over time. So it's not enough to just log the parameters. You need to log the extra context that you're giving in the prompt. You need to log what is the version of model that you're using in the LLM. So the principle is the same, is the short answer, but you capture a lot more metadata to deal with these determinism, the non-determinism. So if something change over time, then you can go back and make sense of it, right? So that's what.
Well, in short, what you're saying, Bharani, is already devs and engineers are sort of overloaded with looking at all the logs and all the metrics that is coming out, either from data systems or Splunk and everything else that's actually being thrown at them. So I think we're making life for the the site reliability engineers and the DevOps guys a little more difficult. But I think in the long run, what you're saying is if you make those investments today, these are definitely going to pay back, in terms of helping improving the success. So this is one of them that you spoke about, which is observability. Any others that you want to sort of plug in?
So the second big pillar, I would say, is you need to have some kind of an evaluation framework. It doesn't matter about the depth of the metrics that you have, but you need to start with some evaluation framework. Because what's going to happen is people say I have a very basic setup and say I'm done with the RAG because there is a similarity search, there is vector store, and things should work. It doesn't work that way, right? Because you need to observe what the users are asking. You need to observe, is your embeddings, is your similarity search actually adding context to the user's questions? And you need to observe, is the model itself performing the way you think it's performing, right? So you need to measure all of this. You need to define metrics and track over time. So I would say start with some evaluation framework for your RAG, for your model and your prompts, and keep a tab on it so that you don't regress over time. So that would be my second big pillar, is good evaluation framework.
So I think what you're saying for our viewers is essentially one is observability, where you're looking at what's coming into the system, how it's being interpreted by the system based on various parameters, and also what's going out. So we're observing. But the evaluation framework, you're taking it a step further, saying that you're looking at all of this in context of desired outcomes, and then sort of measuring this as well, saying as to whether for a given input in a given context, was the outcome satisfactory? Did the user mark it as something that was offensive? Did they mark it as something inappropriate? Did they mark it as something inaccurate? Were they happy with the response? Were they not happy? And a variety of other things. So this is, this is really something that will sort of help, accelerate how people can see, success with LLMs as they deploy them. But curious, since you mentioned frameworks, what are the popular frameworks out there, Bharani, today? And are there many? And how does one go about choosing one of them?
So many teams inside the company, many of my teams have used Ragas. So that's probably the most interesting, most popular framework. But yes, this space is exploding. There are more frameworks every day. So you should watch out the space. But to name a few, Ragas is the framework I would choose. Right?
So as you're tuning a chatbot or you're tuning an LLM that's actually in production, you're changing components, you're changing different elements of this. You're sort of using a slightly different library, you're using a slightly different data set. How does one, the observability and the evaluation frameworks, do they aid in backward and forward compatibility in any way, or in terms of rewinding back and looking forward? Or is that even a relevant question?
It is relevant because mostly these operate at the seam of the system. So they only work via an API call. So most of these evaluation frameworks cover a wide variety of models. So you are good from that perspective. And observability is at the network layer as well. So that's also good. So they are fairly decoupled at this stage. So that should not be a concern of your choice of a framework or an orchestration model.
So observability, evaluation framework, are these enough, or is there a third?
Yeah, so I saved the last one. This is the most important one. You did talk about, what if the response from the LLM is not right, it's not offensive, or what if we are feeding sensitive? Let's say if you're using a commercial platform as a service model, what if you send like privately identifiable information to public cloud? Right, these are this concern, and that's why we have seen people adopt some kind of a guardrail. So it's basically you are constraining an LLM not to deviate from the guardrail that you set in, right? And there are a number of points in which you can apply guardrail. For example, you can put a guardrail that I should not be sending my patented information outside my company, even though I'm trusting a third-party provider. No patented info should go out, and that's a guardrail, right? You can have a policy or a tone of your enterprise and say, I don't want the LLM to use any other tone. So that can be a guardrail for the response out from the LLM. So you can go live without guardrails, but I would strictly recommend that you don't. So that would be my third pillar for going to production is invest in guardrails. You need to have some kind of a guardrail for both the input to the LLM and also the output from the LLM.
This is great stuff, Bharani. I mean, so we spoke about observability, we spoke about evaluation frameworks. Now you've spoken about guardrails, more like a safety net, really,
Yeah.
so that if you fall, you stumble, but you stumble into something soft. And one question on, say, safety net and guardrails. I've been reading pretty interesting stuff on how people are building some of these guardrails. Wanted to get a view from you on this. So I'm hearing that people are deploying LLMs to actually check outputs of other LLMs. As people are deploying, GANs, which are generative adversarial networks, to sort of, test and see whether outputs from LLMs are looking great. And then they're also sort of, the simplistic ones are sort of deploying classifiers to see whether outputs are like. So what is your take on this? I mean, there seems to be a variety of approaches, some that are simple, some that are complex. I mean, deploying another LLM to test an LLM before you got one into production seems like really complex.
I think if you want to start simple, I would say that there is this excellent library from NVIDIA called Nemo Guardrail. It's simplistic because you can write guardrails as simple rules in a language called Golang. It's very domain specific. It's very English-like. So you can define what rules that you want LLM to follow, and you can embed in whatever points and junctures I spoke of, right? You can embed it like before you give an input to the RAG, or you can embed it after you got the response from the LLM. So that's one way to start simple, and then you can evolve, saying like the way you described, Ranjit, you can have a stronger LLM evaluate a weaker LLM, and so on and so forth.
So I just want to sort of spend some more time on something else that you mentioned early on, right? You mentioned something called legal. So wanted to spend some time to talk about the non-technical aspects of LLM success. And I'm sure across your wide exposure to global clients and many deployments, would love to hear, some anecdotes and some, specific instances that stand out where some non-technical aspects are also relevant, so that our viewers will sort of get an idea as to what all they should also be thinking apart from just the technical aspects.
Yeah. So the first point is I'm not a lawyer, so I take it with a pinch of salt, or I can't give you legal advice. But having said that, you need to be careful on how you're using LLM and what are the implications of the responses that come out of this LLM-powered product that you're building, right? I can think of one public use case where there is this chatbot from an airline company, and it just randomly made out a policy that did not exist, right? And then the judge has to rule that anything in your site, whether it's from a chatbot or a static page, it is representing your brand. So if the chatbot made up a policy that did not exist, you're liable to the chatbot, the output of the chatbot.
So in essence, Bharani, I think what you're saying is if your LLM hallucinates and you've actually put an LLM in production that's actually touching customers,
yeah,
depending on the country and the laws in which you are actually in the midst of, you can actually be held accountable for a hallucination. What else, Bharani, please?
You should also pay attention to, if you are in a very niche domain, you should also pay attention to the data on which your model is trained on, because we know all the kind of lawsuits that that are coming up. This space is evolving so rapidly, so that's something that you have to pay attention. If you're working with a very domain-specific LLM, or you're picking an LLM that's already trained on your domain, then you need to be aware of what's the data set on which the model is trained on. So
what you're saying then essentially, Bharani, is that even if you have actually chosen a commercial LLM, it still makes sense to sort of pay attention to the data on which that LLM has been trained, and the clauses for indemnity and many other related topics. Because if you are going to be, if your LLM is going to be, giving out responses based on that. Depending on the LLM that you're using, either you will be responsible for it or the LLM service provider is responsible for it. So there are various things that people have to pay attention. Some things which are probably beyond tech and engineering scope and involves other functions. So
Yeah.
you're saying that we need to obviously be more, paying more attention to all these areas that actually sort of, touch on the business and its responsibilities to its customers. Very,
Yeah.
very good points, Bharani. I mean, these are outstanding points for people to sort of start paying attention to. Great. Any other aspects that you think that they should look for?
Yeah, so look for the policy of data retention, because if you are using a hosted LLM, there are chances that they may or may not use your data for training, right? And again, the whole industry has come a long way. So I would say, again, check with your legal department, check with your service provider. There may be a point of time in which your data is kept in memory. There may be a point in time where the data is used for training. You should be aware of all these facts so that you don't have surprises in the end.
So we spoke about legal, and then we spoke about risks, which are also related to legal, which are brand risks, customer, sentiment risks, and many other types of risks. What about privacy, Bharani? Is that a topic for, for devs and engineers to be worried about, or should they discuss this openly with their functional and business heads? What would you recommend, and what aspects should they be talking about?
I think a good rule when it comes to PII data, and we have GDPR now. I think in India, DPDP Act is going to come in. All of that still applies to your generative AI apps, right? So a good rule of thumb is not to expose PII data to any of the providers. In the same way that you would build a traditional app, the same logic applies here, right? Like, don't expose your PII. If you have account numbers, don't deal with an LLM with your account numbers, because you can identify them. So it's that generic rule. That's pretty much it. I can't think it's any different from building a traditional product. You have to be protective of your personal data.
No, this is superb stuff. I think we've spent a lot of time talking to you about a variety of topics. For people who are just sort of stepping into the space and starting off, any notes or any tips in conclusion in terms of how they should approach this, button?
I think there is a lot of anxiety, right? Like, a lot of programmers think, their jobs are at stake. A lot of graduates think, is there going to be a job in the future? I would say we've always had this threat, right? Like, when the language is important, okay, the assembly programmers felt, oh, you know what, is my job going to go away because it's very easy to write programs? And so on and so forth. I would say that the first thing to start is to understand what these are. So go back to basics. I would recommend people to actually read, or if not the actual paper, the summary of the paper that actually started all of this, right? Like, the attention is all you need, is the paper that started the whole transformer revolution. So I would say start with that, right? Get your foundations right and get the architecture of all these LLMs. Once you have this conceptual idea, I think all of these will fall in place, right? You will know how to wield this marvelous architecture that is there for you to build your next big product.
No, those are strong words, Bharani, and I think they make resounding sense to me. Start not only using foundational models, but also build your foundation strong and sort of build on top of that is what you're suggesting. Bharani Subramaniam, this session has been pure gold. We've covered a variety of topics very eloquently, and you've sort of woven all these things together in a matter as though these were really simple. And great to having you with us. But I'm just not going to let you go, right now. Still do have a couple of questions for you. But
Okay.
these are the fun questions. I mean, not that it's not been fun so far, but these are the fun questions. So if I was to ask you, what is your one prediction for AI for the coming year or the 12 months? What would that be?
Wow, 12 months is a big window. Not a prediction, but my personal wish. I wish, you can run bigger models or the newer models, as performant as they can now on GPU in a traditional CPU. Because, all these models require a lot of compute power, and because of which we either go for a GPU-based deployments or a special, either a TPU, which is a tensor processing unit, or something similar, right? But the CPU is catching up. So I wish in 10 years it all becomes the hardware catches up, that I don't feel the difference between my laptop and a server, or B, the models get leaner, that it can be executed from a CPU itself. So that's my personal wish. I don't know if it's going to happen in 4 months.
No, that's interesting. I think if NVIDIA folks are paying attention here, I think they will probably be looking out. And if the Intel and AMD are here, they probably already know this, I guess. That's an interesting perspective indeed. One more question, which is counterintuitive, but let me ask this anyway. What do you think is the one thing that is not going to change in the next 10 years?
Okay, 10 years, again, is a big window. But one thing that's not going to change in the near future is the whole human in the loop. I know the models are getting smarter. I know you can have a lot more polished product. But it's very important to have a human in the loop. It's ethical, it's responsive, it's our responsibility. So the humans are not going to go away completely. So no matter what complex systems, what kind of advanced automation that we're thinking of, I think humans are going to be in some form or other to have checks and balance.
That perfectly aligns, with TheNeural's objectives as well, where we are putting the humans in the center of AI and sort of focusing on them. Thank you so much for joining us again. And it's been a real pleasure, and look forward to having you again soon and double-clicking on more areas and exploring them and having more fun talks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranjit. Thanks for having me.
Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Neural Talks. Hit subscribe or follow us on LinkedIn to stay informed of many more great episodes on AI coming up. We're The Neural, where humans meet AI.